Department Assembly, Senate Chamber, Programme Sound.
Morning members, you're very welcome to this morning's committee meeting. For those who are coming into the public gallery, just to alert them about the use of mobile devices. It can be used only through Wi-Fi connection. All devices should be muted. Password details are available on the gallery rules for anyone wanting to connect to the Assembly's Wi-Fi network. 3G and 4G should not be used, and there should be no recordings or photographs taken during this session. The briefings today will be from the Department on Regional Planning and Strategic Planning. That was deferred over from last week, and a further briefing from Rivers and Flooding. I've just received an apology from David Hilditch, who won't be joining us today. I have no chairperson's business. Moving then to item 3, which is the draft minutes, which are at page 6. They're for the meeting of the 19th of February. Our members agreed that they are an accurate minute. Great, thank you. Moving then to item 4, which matters arising at page 14. Matters arising from the meeting of the 19th of February. Do members have any issues? I actually had intended to raise at last week's meeting. There had been mention of the utility regulator, and I just wanted to ask if members would be content that we give an invitation to the utility regulator to come to speak to us just in relation to the price control. Maybe we could get that put into our forward work programme at some stage if members are content to do that. Are there any other issues, Mr. Muir?
Just in terms of matters arising, Chair, I think we raised it last week and I'll raise it again this week in terms of getting an update from the Department around the MOT situation. This is turning into a bit of a saga, really, to be honest. We need an update on it.
Well, it has, and I think obviously there are some newspapers have more information than we have as the committee, so I think if we could maybe ask them again just to give us a little bit of urgency in relation to do that, because they had been very good in giving us updates, but I'm guessing there's a lot more information there that hasn't been shared. So
yeah, there's been an extension obviously granted for 4 months, but that time's now starting to run down, and we need to be able to give guidance to the public, really, because they really are looking to see what the way forward is in relation to this. I understood there was a report meant to have came early last week, but there's been nothing more. So
we haven't heard anything in relation to the engineer's report, and nor any sort of discussions that they'd had with the manufacturers with regards to who has responsibility. So it might be useful to get that information as well.
I agree it should be pursued as to what is happening in this area, and in particular if there are to be any changes to the rules around MOTs to deal with this situation. Is there a requirement for any new legislation, because the 4 month is fast running out if legislation is required?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other members, any issues in relation to this? No. Great, thank you. Moving then to item 5, which is our correspondence. There, on page 18 is obviously the list and the suggested action. Just draw your attention to the invitation which I'd received to address the infrastructure working group. Unfortunately, this came in quite late and it was too short notice for me to attend. But if members are agreed to note, and in future they may ask again, and again it may be short notice, but just to get members' agreement that if that happens that I can attend on behalf of the committee.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Other issues, there's a 5.5. We have correspondence in relation to quarry regulations. Again, that's something we might want to raise in the sessions we have today. But obviously, if you want to forward that correspondence on to the department for comment.
So just through you, Chair, the quarry licence and stuff, there's nobody here today to answer on that? No? In terms of quarry licensing, no?
No, I think it may, just in relation to planning.
Yeah, I did just find out that we update on the regulations where we're at. I mean, just okay. Like to be, you're going to forward on for response to the department, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Any members, any other comments? 5.4 is the ministerial response as a consequence of the meeting of the 5th of February. Obviously there's some updates there in relation to a number of issues that members had raised, including obviously the integrated community transport, the plans for Hyde Bank which were raised. The legislative programme is still, we're not really any sort of further forward with regards to that at all. And then there's a considerable amount of time spent there on the impacts of EU funding. If members have any further questions they want to address in relation to that, Ms Anderson?
Yeah, I'm looking particularly at the European funding for the Derry Coleraine line, the technical equipment and infrastructure upgrade. And that's 2015. The information is here, and we have information from 2015 of 11.2 million from the EU as a contribution to the 37.8 million that was spent. There's also, this is an Annex B, there's also the Swell NI water, as well as the source to tap, significant funding in 2016, 25 million of EU funding, and we have that up until the funding allocations up until 2017, given that we're now approaching 2020 and the end of spend for this tranche of funding. If we could get more information, particularly with regards to the funding streams, research and development, as well as just Interreg and the CEF funding. So I would like this further developed, because you can see in 2016 there was European funding awarded of 45 million to infrastructure. 2017 it dropped to, but it's quite significant still, 25 million. I would like that further rolled out for 2018, 2019, and then with an understanding how the gap in funding is going to be bridged as we go forward.
Okay. Content? Do that?
Chair, just on the community transport part of it, could we get a proper briefing on this, I suppose, really, to see why particularly Strand 2 failed? I think because it doesn't really go into detail about that, so would it be worth us requesting a proper briefing in terms of the community transport?
We have community transport coming up in a few weeks' time. They've actually delayed now.
Okay.
You'll see that from the Forward Work programme. But the official who has oversight of community transport wasn't in attendance that day that we received the overall the briefing, so it might be useful if she can make herself available.
That would be great, thank you.
Sure. Sorry, just on the Hyde Bank stuff, obviously I asked a question previously about the emissions test. Now, I know this is a new centre of excellence for the DVA, but do we have an answer in relation to the emissions test and the new smoke test? Is it all going to be generated out of that centre or whatever? That's a couple of years away. There's maybe more clarification on the emission test, on the future testing of vehicles.
Okay. Anything further in relation to that correspondence? There's a further update there on page 27 in relation to the reservoirs transfer functions legislation, which was raised last week.
And obviously that one, where's that, 27, did you say?
Page 27.
Okay.
That came out of the Minister's briefing. We'd asked for further information. But that process is to be made by an order from DERA, so it's, we are waiting in relation to that, although when you had asked further questions in relation as to how this had actually happened.
Yeah, I was going to say that's given
instance.
us maybe how in terms we're going to address
we
around the transfer function, but I would like to know, well, how do we get to this point in the first place?
We have asked that question, so hopefully we'll have that in our packs by next week.
Chair, mine is really to do with how you define proportionate regulatory framework, given particular difficulties in my constituency around what are deemed to be controlled reservoirs that were cosmetic lakes, really, which are having a huge detrimental impact on planning and development for the area. So I would like to know how and do they define and what reference do they use for proportionate regulatory framework?
Okay.
Because it seems to me their interpretation of that has been far too cautious.
Well, I think we probably all have examples of that.
Yeah.
We can put that to officials later on in today's meeting.
Appreciate that.
Okay, members content or any further issues in relation to this? No? Okay. At this point, we can really look at the table papers then at page 3, which is correspondence from the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation. That's inviting myself to their Northern Ireland region annual dinner, and that's next week. So are members content that I attend that?
Great. Yeah.
Right. Content then with all the suggested means of addressing each of the correspondence. Thank you very much. Then moving on into our first briefing, which is from the Department on Regional Planning and Strategic Planning. And we will be welcoming Angus Carey, who's the Chief Planner and Director of Regional Planning, Alistair Beggs, Director of Strategic Planning, Scott Symington, Head of Operational Governance, and Susan Wilkin, Head of Plan Scrutiny. You're all very welcome to the committee this morning, and can I apologise for last week? Unfortunately, we did overrun. Members were engrossed by the issues around budget, so unfortunately we had to delay to this week. So thank you for...
No problem at all. Thank you.
Okay, so if you'd like to open with a statement, and members will follow up with some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having us here today. Really, for I suppose an introductory briefing about the work of the DFI Planning Group. I've Alistair Beggs is here, who is Director of Strategic Planning Directorate within the group, and his Deputy Director Susan Wilkin, and also Scott Symington, Deputy Director on Regional Planning Directorate. The papers have sort of shown you that there's the two directorates within the group: Regional Planning Directorate, which I'm the director of, and then Strategic that Alistair is. If you're content with this, Chair, Alistair and I will give just a brief overview of the work of each of the directorates, and then I think there'll be plenty of time for questions after that, if that makes sense. I suppose it's important as well to say that both directorates within the department work very closely together on the sort of the many complex planning issues that come our way. We have a mixed team of professional planners and administrative people as well in the team. My directorate's more focused on the sort of policy, legislation and kind of oversight role, and then Alistair's side deals with the more operational stuff in terms of the region significant planning applications and also the development plan sort of scrutiny role. So in terms of, I suppose, more looking at my side and a bit of background, as you'll be aware, since April 2015 we now have a new two-tier planning system in operation in Northern Ireland, and this is a major reform and transfer of planning, really the single biggest change that we've had since the early 70s to the planning system, and it came about through the implementation of the Planning Act, which at the time was the largest piece of primary legislation that had ever gone through the Assembly, and involved a huge amount of work at the time with the committee of the day. And really, I suppose that the key changes that were introduced through that was to create a much more responsive planning system delivered at a local level by councils, and really with enhanced local political accountability. It also introduced a new two-stage and faster development plan system, with a much less adversarial approach and more meaningful level of community involvement in the process. It focused on a more effective development management system for dealing with planning applications, again with a focus on balancing the economic, environmental and social impact of those developments. There was improved efficiency and processing and greater certainty around timescales for developers and communities. Also, a key change that was brought in was a much more front-loaded approach to planning, involving both developers and communities much earlier on in both the plan and the development management process, and also an emphasis on collaborative working around all the stakeholders involved in planning, and ultimately a more proportionate decision-making mechanisms classified by different applications to try and deal with planning in a more efficient way. So, and I suppose this new two-tier system of planning brought Northern Ireland into line with all of the other jurisdictions in these islands, who all have a two-tier system. So the last few years, I suppose, have been a period of kind of huge change for everybody involved in planning, and I suppose it's been important for us in the centre to allow that new system to bed in a little bit and allow councils to get used to operating this new system, members to understand their role in making some of the decisions, and also for the planners and support staff to get used to that as well. Equally for ourselves in the department, a new role for us at the sort of centre of that that new two-tier system, and trying to get to grips with our role and how we relate with the councils and the work that they're doing at the more local level. And I suppose that links in quite nicely into one of the key responsibilities of my directorate within the department is about really oversight and governance of the planning system. And the Planning Act itself does confer a range of responsibilities collectively onto the department, which give us an overarching role in monitoring the operation of planning functions. It provides the department with the capability to oversee and secure the effective implementation of regional policy and good practice by councils. These range of powers include things like the power to call in planning applications, make development orders, regulating how councils deal with applications, conduct assessments of council performance, and the department also has a series of reserve powers, enforcement powers, and revocation, discontinuance, modification, those sorts of powers as well, among some others. So, in addition, my directorate also works closely with councils to improve planning performance. To do this, we meet regularly with the heads of planning from councils and also council directors at what we call our quarterly strategic planning group meeting, and a number of other meetings and subgroups throughout the year. We publish performance indicators against 3 statutory targets. Local applications, the target is 15 weeks. Major applications, for which the target is 30 weeks. And enforcement as well, to bring to conclusion within 39 weeks. There's been good progress with some of that, particularly around the locals and the enforcement. However, there are challenges around major applications, and the target isn't being met with those. Average processing times 18-19, around 59 weeks across all councils. So in addition also to those statutory targets, we also published last September our first planning monitoring framework, which covers a range of additional indicators about the planning system, because obviously those 3 statutory indicators only tell really a very small part of the story. The other indicators that we've developed, I can kind of give you a better picture of really what's going on and a better understanding of where some of the issues are, and actually also where some of the good practices as well. The purpose of the framework really is to increase that understanding and to drive best practice and continuous improvement, encourage councils and ourselves to talk about what's going on. Over time, we do want to expand that framework. And finally, on planning performance, one area that has been highlighted as impacting on application processing times recently, in particular, has been statutory consultees. And the time it takes statutory consultees to interact with the system and how they interact with the system. So to address that and other factors around performance, we've recently established a planning forum involving all the main statutory consultees to take forward a range of actions aimed at improving planning performance. And that was on the back of an independent review that was done of the performance of statutory consultees in the planning system. So my directorate is also responsible for formulating and coordinating regional planning policy and for maintaining an effective legislative framework for the overall planning system. So the key policy documents for which we have responsibility, and you'll be familiar with, are the Regional Development Strategy to 2035 and also the Strategic Planning Policy Statement, which essentially covers all the topic planning policies that you'll be familiar with and used to be in their own separate PPSs, like development in the countryside, housing, retailing, renewable energy, etc. Plus, it contains the purpose of planning and also core planning principles. So the team monitors the effectiveness of that policy and how it's been implemented and considers whether it's fit for purpose and whether it needs to be reviewed and changed. And we will be discussing planning policy issues with the Minister in the coming weeks. In terms of legislation, again, we will be discussing legislation with the Minister in the coming weeks, but there are ever some subordinate legislation which we have already been doing some background work on, particularly around permit development changes, telecommunications, also the requirement to review the implementation of the Planning Act, and the subordinate legislation that needs to be implemented through that, and also inflationary uplift of fees and some other areas as well. The Directorate is responsible for preparing and updating guidance and practice notes as well for the system. So if the Minister wishes to proceed with these kind of changes in these policy and legislation areas, obviously that they will be taken through the committee in the normal way, and there will be plenty of debate and also in terms of policy, public consultation process as well. So added to these key areas, I'm coming to the end now, RPD also leads on the delivery of environmental governance work programme to build capacity, training and guidance around environmental governance in the planning system. The Director is responsible for the implementation of the Executive's Rathlin Island Policy and Action Plan, and finally the procurement of a new shared planning IT system for planning. So that was a very quick whistle-stop tour of all the work that we do in the team, which I hope gives you a bit of an indication of what we're about. And thank you for listening. And I'm going to pass you over to Alistair now. He'll talk about his side and what they do.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, members. Angus has already explained our close working role that we have with his directorate, the regional planning side, and that our role in the strategic planning directorate is looking more towards the operational side of the department's planning function. The briefing note before you, I'm not going to refer to that in detail, but I'll talk through to you some of the major elements of the work which we carry out. One of those major areas is in relation to the local development plans, which are currently being prepared by the councils. And you'll be aware that this, for the first time, the councils can lead the development plan process. It's a chance for the plans to reflect and be responsive to the council's aspirations, the needs, and indeed the differences between the councils. And the importance of these plans, I think, can be set out in terms of the way that they are going to guide the development management process in the future. And you'll be perhaps aware that the legislation requires planning applications to be decided having regard to the local development plan and to any other material considerations. And you might also be aware that this is a two-stage process. The first stage of the process is the development of the plan strategies, which will be setting out the general policy framework to guide development in the future, and this is where the councils are in this stage of the process at the moment. Once the plan strategies are adopted, then they'll be working on local plans which will deal more with the site specifics of an area. The department is very much a consultee in the process in one aspect, and responses that we've been making to the development plans have been focusing on elements such as the growth strategies, cross-council working and infrastructure availability. And we also coordinate departmental consultation responses to the council's plans, and that's a process which involves our colleagues throughout the department in roads, transport, rivers and water policy. And the department also has an oversight role in relation to the plan process. The department has the power to intervene at certain stages of that process, perhaps to direct or councils to withdraw or amend their plans, and ultimately the department directs plans to be adopted. Now, we're working with the councils closely as we go on through this new and what is an unfamiliar process because of the changes since the introduction of the two-tier system. And we're pleased with the efforts that the councils have been taking in moving their plans forward with this unfamiliar process. Now, the table in the briefing paper shows the council's progress to date, but broadly all 11 have now prepared statements of community involvement and prepared options papers, and 7 of the 11 have prepared draft plan strategies which have been consulted on. I think it's important probably to point out that the Planning Appeals Commission have been asked to hold an independent examination in relation to the Belfast plan strategy, and that will probably occur around about the middle of the year. Following that, the PAC will make recommendations as to that document's soundness. Another main area of our work, which again Angus has touched on, our planning applications. We currently have about 40 applications before us of various types, and the two that you're probably going to hear most about are regionally significant planning applications and called-in applications. Regionally significant applications, the legislation sets out thresholds of what a regionally significant application is, and those fall to the department to determine. And being regionally significant, they're often large, often complex and contentious. In terms of called-in applications, there's a process for calling those in. They could be called in by a minister at the start of the process when they're submitted, or they can be called in at the latter stage when a council has made its view known on the application. But to give you a flavour of the sorts of things that we've been dealing with, I think last year we issued approvals for the transport hub in Belfast, a cruise ship terminal down at Belfast Harbour, also a gas power plant down at Belfast Harbour, Grade A offices at Embrington and at City Quays in Belfast, and urban extensions to Ballyclare. So that gives you a broad flow of quite a wide variety of work which we carry out. And a lot of our work also involves attending hearings and public inquiries before the Planning Appeals Commission. For example, where the department issues a notice of opinion that it intends to approve or refuse an application, an applicant or council can request a hearing before the minister before any final decision is made. In terms of all our work which we carry out, you'll see that the brief refers to Crumlin Road Jail. You'll be aware that's a very successful visitor attraction currently ongoing there, with almost 1.2 million visitors have visited it since it opened in 2012, and the operator there employs about 70 people. That's important not only to the regeneration of the jail itself, but also benefits the wider community in terms of the employment and training that is carried out for members of the local community. And we've had recently an encouraging response to an invite of expressions for interest in regeneration of the former wardens' cottages at the jail. Those constitute quite an important frontage along the main road there, and the Minister has now agreed that the formal marketing of those cottages can be taken forward. In relation to the St Lucia's site, which we also have responsibility for, you'll see from the briefing note that it was gifted to the Executive in 2010. The Department does own part of that site, including green areas down by the Strull River and some of the former military housing on the site. The historic core there remains in the ownership of the Ministry of Defence, and the issue of restrictive covenants, which once affected those particular buildings, was resolved in 2018, and we've been discussing the transfer of the buildings to the Department with the MOD recently. And it's an interesting site close to Omer Town Centre, but it does have a number of challenges with it in terms of the historic buildings, the condition of the buildings, and the floodplain issues there as well. But there's ongoing discussions between ourselves and the Department for Communities and local and council in looking at the options available for that particular site, and we'll be briefing the Minister on progress on that in due course. So that's a broad oversight of the work that we do. Thank you for listening, and we'll be happy to try and assist you with any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very much. And I suppose really from the outset, declaring an interest that my brother is chair of the Planning Committee in Ardson North Down Borough Council. I'm not really sure if it is an interest, but just in case someone raises it. Angus, you've spoken very positively about the two-tier system, but 2015 was a really difficult year with the new councils coming into existence and the planning functions transferring across. Now, essentially what you had was you had a function with no money following that function. You had new teams being established. You also had brand new legislation which they had to work with. There's an understanding that perhaps there was poor guidance and inadequate training, both probably for the planners, but particularly for new councillors and old councillors who perhaps had bad habits from the previous planning system. Essentially, they were advocates as opposed to planners, and yet they were being put in a position where they had to make decisions. In hindsight, would you look at differently with regards to how you would have approached the setting up of that system?
That's a good question, a difficult question. I mean, I suppose, the first thing I would say was we did do a heck of a lot of work around the time leading up to the transfer and after the transfer in terms of preparing for it. And capacity building programs for staff and for members and all of that, and huge amount of engagement and work in terms of getting guidance and the legislation and all of that right. But it was incredibly challenging. I mean, I can't say anything other than that. It was reforming the planning system, transferring it, not just transferring planning from say one department to another department. It was transferring planning to 11 councils which didn't actually exist at the time of trying to sort out the transfer to them. So it was hugely challenging, and there's probably lots of things that maybe could have been done differently and better. And we were where we were with the way it was done, and the other parallel processes of local government reform and the way that was going through, and we had to just get the job done with that. Having said that, looking back now and reflecting on kind of 4 years of this new system, it's not perfect. There's no way that it's perfect, and it wasn't perfect before we transferred it across either. There were lots of problems, and there are lots of problems with such a complex system like planning, and it's the same when you talk to colleagues in the other jurisdictions. There are lots of challenges there, but I mean, we did, I think, really collectively between ourselves and councils achieve an amazing transfer. The world didn't stop. Whenever we transferred, applications continue to be processed, decisions continue to be put out. The staffs continue to get paid, which is one of my personal kind of worries at the time. Just basic things like that when you're involved in a transfer of that nature, IT, finance, HR, never mind all the planning processes. So yes, I mean, I didn't have the grey hairs before that process, and it was very challenging, and there probably are things that we could have done differently, and we have done a sort of a kind of a review process, if you like, internally about the project and all the things that we did in the project and the benefits realisation and all of that, and there are interesting things come out of that in terms of what you might do again differently.
And are you satisfied that the guidance and the training that is currently in place is sufficient for both planners and for members?
I think there's more work that can be done on that as well. I mean, we work closely with NILGA to try and help them prepare training for members in particular, and I definitely would identify that as being a key area where we do need to improve and provide even more training. There's no doubt about that. In addition, we have a suite of guidance which is there. We've recently reviewed that, and we've actually identified guidance which is really too old and out of date, really, and can't do planning. We've taken that off the website, and we've committed to a programme of looking at updating guidance and preparing new guidance. And one of the areas where we have really focused in terms of trying to improve capacity and guidance is around the whole environmental governance issue, which has been a huge challenge for planning both before and after transfer, in terms of making sure that the capacities within the profession and within the councils and ourselves to actually deal properly with the very challenging environmental requirements of EIA, SEA and the Habitats Directive, and how they apply to planning. So we've done a huge amount of work there, and we will be bringing forward new guidance in that area in the summer. I think we plan to do that at the first stage of it.
Just in relation to the environmental governance, I mean, that's in paragraph 14 of your paper. We now have a situation where applications are essentially being assessed by two bodies. We have NIEA, who are obviously the statutory consultee, with shared environmental services paid, funded by councils. On occasion, they will come back to councils with different opinion on an application. So whose advice do the planners and the councillors take? Because essentially that's quite confusing.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, in a sense, this links to the question about the capacity within the councils. Whenever we transferred, one of the issues we realised, one of the challenges about the system in Northern Ireland is that councils here do not have all the functions that they have in the other jurisdictions. So it's very helpful to have planning along with, conservation, biodiversity, local roads and all of that. And there's an expertise within councils in the other jurisdictions that can feed in to help the planners make the right decisions. We didn't have that in Northern Ireland. So when we transferred, we set up the shared environmental service, which essentially is a bit like having an environmental expertise within each of the councils, except that we did it as a shared service, hosted in Mid and East Antrim. So that is, if you like, the shared environmental service is really just part of the council system. The statutory consultee on environmental issues is still DERA. and DAERA ultimately have the final say in terms of the statutory process into planning. Really, the purpose of the Shared Environmental Service is to provide local expertise for members and for planners to take what DAERA are saying as a statutory consultee and develop it and understand it in terms of how it applies to the planning decision that they're about to make. So it's not to usurp the role of the statutory consultee in terms of DAERA. It's to help it's to bring the expertise within the councils to help deal with what DAERA are saying and how it applies to planning.
Although I'm not sure that that's necessarily applied, so perhaps maybe more guidance around that might be helpful too. You've referred to the statistics indicating that councils are performing reasonably well. There would be some who may say that there could be a manipulation of those statistics, and that where councils are simply prioritising what would be more straightforward applications and leaving the more tricky ones to later. What would your comment be in relation to that?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a challenge across any kind of walk of life where you introduce targets and indicators, and you don't tend to drive perverse behaviour, but sometimes that can happen. I mean, we, as I said, we do a lot of work with the councils, and genuinely I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but I mean, I genuinely don't get the sense that that's what any of them are about. They are very serious about the role that they're taking on. They're very keen to try and progress it as quickly as we can. I mentioned earlier that the sort of planning forum that we've set up as a result of the review that really head of the civil service instigated into performance of statutory consultees, and it kind of broadened into performance of planning, to be honest. And we've done a lot of work with councils around that and trying to actually understand what are the issues and problems that they have with getting applications out reasonably quickly and within the targets, and how can we kind of work together to address some of those issues. So, I mean, yeah, you could change the targets, but it might drive other behaviour, and that's really not. I mean, my approach is to work with them to improve performance. It's not to get too tied up about targets. You need to have them, and we've introduced the other indicators as well, which are interesting and show some of the other things that are going on. For example, around the performance of statutory consultees and so on. It's about driving that continuous improvement collaboratively with the councils and helping them as much as we can to really take that forward.
Okay, and finally for me, I have a situation obviously in my own constituency, and I'm guessing others have too, where disused quarries have been put back into use. I'm just curious where the department is in relation to the review of the minerals, the old minerals planning permission.
Yeah, well, I mean, it has been around for quite a while, and there is a bit of a history to it in the sense of originally when it came through, it was at kind of in the recession, and decisions were made back before I was ever involved in it to put it on hold. So we'd started this kind of before the minister had come in, but we're kind of accelerating it now. We're looking at what we need to do to really properly consider ROMPs and how it will be implemented now in the new system. It is actually in the Planning Act when we transfer it across. So it's there. There may need to be some tweaks made to the approach that's set out, because it sort of goes back to originally 2006, and there may need to be some work done in terms of how we commence that. But that's what we're working on at the moment. We want to talk to the minister about that. So it's certainly an area we're aware of that is a problem across a number of council areas.
And will it be applied retrospectively?
Well, that's kind of the nature of it. In whatever way that it applies, it will apply to old permissions, and mean that those permissions have to be reviewed and either kind of revoked and taken away or updated with new, more modern conditions. Which, when you look at some old conditions from the 70s or old approvals from the 70s, they're like one line, there's hardly any conditions on them, whereas if you were getting a permission now for a quarry, as you can imagine, there's like a whole list of conditions and around opening times, noise, vibrations and all sorts of things like that. So it does apply retrospectively. That's kind of the purpose of it in a way, to go back and look at old permissions and try and get them into a position where they're meeting modern standards.
So obviously the implications environmentally, there are issues, but also neighbour issues, and it's been quite difficult for a number of folk.
Absolutely. The other thing I would say just about that as well is that, again, I keep having, it's sort of one of the things about the two-tier system. We have to engage closely with the councils about ROMPs, because if ROMPs comes in, it'll have quite a huge implication on their workload, back to the staffing and resources and so on them, and then also engage with the industry as well. Okay. And we have had some conversations with them on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you. Angus Allister, thank you very much for your presentation so far. I just want to follow on from the chair. She must have been reading my notes, but anyway, with regard to reasonably well on your oversight role of the council, do you do any oversight of the applicants, or ask the applicants how they feel the process is going?
No, we don't actually. That is something we used to originally under the unitary system when it was planning service. There used to be a sort of a questionnaire was done, to gauge kind of applicant satisfaction with the planning process. But we don't do that now. And I do know that.
Is that something you should do?
Well, I think that it's really part of the two-tier system. It's really a matter for councils to do that about their own planning service. And I know that. That some of them, for example, Belfast, are working on that sort of area. It has come up in some of our conversations and so on. I think it's a good idea, but it's a matter really for them to take forward at that local level.
And you see the oversight and role, if you don't mind getting into it a wee bit deeper, Angus, so whenever you have your quarterly meetings with my own council, Mad Ulster, for example, what detail are you getting into with them and how they're performing? Because if you did ask applicants, they would say they're not performing well. But how deep do you go into that?
Well, I mean, there's a set agenda that we have, Chris Boomer will be there as head of planning for your area. All the heads of planning are there, plus some directors from certain councils. And on that agenda, continuous improvement is one of the items that we do go into in quite a degree of detail. And we talk about, the overall kind of performance of the system, the indicators. There's been lots of conversations around particularly majors. Because majors is where the difficulties have been, and most of the councils are not hitting their target on majors, and it's a very open and frank conversation about the issues that they have. As I've said earlier, we're developing that into now as well the planning forum, where we at the department are talking to the statutory consultees and how they are performing and inputting into that system. And then also at the last strategic planning group meeting, we've instigated a subgroup really looking at planning performance and the performance of statutory consultees, which actually Scott will be chairing, and that will be getting into even more detail to feed back up into the strategic planning group on what the issues are with performance, particularly around the majors. And some of the heads of planning from the group will sit on that along with some of their colleagues from councils.
You mentioned consultees. Do you have any influence on times for feedback? And do you take that into account if a council is not performing, that ultimately it wasn't their fault, it was the consultee? Do you take that all into account?
Well, our oversight rule, it's not that we're kind of delving into every kind of council and every application and sort of saying that's not good enough and that's not good enough. It's not we couldn't do that. We don't have the resources to do that. It's much more of a sort of a strategic oversight role. So we are talking as part of the work that I've described here about the 21 days target for statutory consultees to reply on, why is it that some statutory consultees are hitting that better than others? Are there things going on in terms of the way that particular target is being implemented? Back to what the chair said about statistics, because sometimes there's agreement to extend the 21-day period and so on. So we're getting into a lot of detail on that, but it's focused not necessarily around lots of individual planning applications. We are doing some of the work on the planning forum around some of the more strategic applications with the statutory consultees. So as part of that, we do actually sort of at that meeting, I will say to the guy who's there from roads, the big applications in the system at the moment on your side are here. There are some of these applications which are well beyond the 21-day period. What's going on with that? So there's a little bit of a challenge, if you like, with the statutory consultees, but it would be impossible to do it for all the applications.
The final point then, as the chair sort of alluded to, regarding NIEA and SES, Shared Environmental Services, a lot of obviously agriculture in my area, indeed a lot of rural areas. If you're a councillor sitting in Mad Ulster Council, you're getting a paper saying one thing and another paper saying another, and you're in the middle. So those two are not helping each other, in my opinion. They're conflicting. And the whole ammonia level issue, which is basically what it is, generally. How do you see that being improved? Because it's causing conflict, it's causing indecisive decision making and no direction, and the councillors are stuck in the middle.
Yeah. I'm aware of that situation. I know it is a difficult situation, and ultimately the councillors and the planning committee have to rely on the advice from the professional planners who will be advising them on the application, and they are the ones that will set out. Here's what Statutory Consultee is saying. Here's what the advice of our shared environmental services. Here's the planning policy framework and the responsibilities that we need to be addressing. And this is the approach that we think we should take for this. And I mean that's planning. Sometimes you do get that situation where the advice coming through from a statutory consultee, whether it's about ammonia and environmental issues or about transport or flooding, or can be set aside if there are other material planning considerations, for example, that outweigh it and so on. It must be considered, it must be weighed. But it's not the case that you always are following a series of kind of pieces of advice which point in the one direction. Sometimes there's conflicting advice, and really the skill of the planner is to balance all of those up and come to the right overall recommendations in the public interest at the end.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mr. Muir.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the officials coming along. Just a couple of questions, a bit varied really, to be honest. Obviously, the Planning Act went through in 2011, and the council sort of came into existence in 2015, formally to have those planning powers. And I would declare for the record I was previously a councillor on Ards in North Downborough Council and also a former employee of TransLink. Is there a plan to do a review of how that planning system is working now, a number of years down the line, where things are, as things could be improved? Because some aspects have worked well. I think it's good to have planning powers devolved to local councils. These are the people on the ground, but whether there's a plan for a review of that. And I would touch upon some of the issues the Chair talked about in terms of sort of the awareness of the elected reps around this. And it's not just particularly the elected reps who are on the planning committee, but it's also the elected reps in the council generally, and also in general sphere of understanding the planning system and some of the issues. Because from speaking to planning officers as well, it's important that whatever engagement they're getting, they're understanding the policy context in which they're working. So that's the first sort of question around the review and the sort of awareness of elected reps.
Well, there's a requirement in the Planning Act. It was actually a requirement introduced by the committee at the time, as it went through, to after 3 years review the implementation of the Act. Yeah. And I think at that time it was because there was a concern that we were bringing through an Act before the local government reform had taken place. It's back to the sort of complexity of this whole thing. So there's sort of almost a will this happen, and if it happens, how will it happen, and so on. So that requirement is there. That hasn't been done yet because we didn't have ministers and so on. We didn't have an assembly, so that's one of the first things that we will be talking to the minister about in terms of complying with that requirement to review the implementation of the Act. Whether the extent and the scope of that review is something that we need to talk about that with the minister, and the level to what we get into on that. I think it's still up for consideration, but it is something that we need to do, and it's something that will be coming through the committee in due course. The terms of the review will be set in supporting legislation and so on, so it'll come to you. And I think, in a more general sense, then it's back to the sort of the conversations that we've been having about working collaboratively with the councils through the various mechanisms that I've talked about to try and understand what's going on there and continually work to improve performance throughout.
The other issue is just in relation to the LDPs and what reviews in terms of the pace. Some councils have done that. Some have done it at a much faster pace. Some have done slower. Different views in relation to that, whether it's better to get it done faster or to do it a bit slower, and just a view in relation to that, because some councils are beating themselves up that they haven't sort of progressed. Then they're also saying that some of them have moved a bit too fast.
Passes that over a question over to Alistair now.
Hi. Yes, I think a lot of the councils are still developing their evidence base in relation to their area plans, hence the speed of them moving forward through this process. Obviously, the new system of LDPs is now based on soundness, and evidence base goes to the heart of that. So I think a lot of the councils are still gathering that and getting their positions with that. And I think, yes, a lot of them have sat back and maybe seen how others have moved forward, and maybe that's to their benefit too. So.
Yeah. In terms of this LDP process, we had BMAP, and there was a legal challenge to that. Is the view that the process we're having now in terms of developing these LDPs will make it a bit more robust in terms of protection from legal challenge, because one of the concerns is that councils are making decisions based upon extremely old development plans because of the legal challenge to BMAP. It's important that these LDPs that come forward are actually be able to get these in place, because the planning decisions that are being made are based upon information and data which is very, very old.
I think that's the desire, of course, to get a full suite of plans. You know, people relying on draft BMAP at the minute is not, I suppose, unusual. Decisions have still been made. With this being a very new process, there may well still be challenges to this process that we haven't foreseen yet, and from where we don't know yet. But we're working with councils to try, at the earliest stages of these process, point them in the direction of producing the soundest plans that we can get.
I think that's important to do that and to work together with them to ensure that occurs. Just a couple of other things was, in relation to the call-in, you've outlined the applications that are called in. What specific criteria for calling something in that you go by?
Again, I think.
Well, yeah, it's a kind of an interesting thing we've done within the group. We've the decision about whether or not that we call in is kind of on my side, and then if I decide to call, if we decide to call something in, then it goes, or if the minister decides to call something in, then it goes to the operational side for Alistair to deal with the application. That's quite a deliberate thing, and of course he gets cross if we decide to call things in. But yeah, so I mean, essentially the criteria is really around. I mean, the first thing I would say is calling a planning application in is an exceptional thing for us to do, and it is not the department's intention. It's the same in all the other jurisdictions, and we've had conversations with sort of chief planners and so on and the others about this, because this is one of the big questions about our new rule in the centre of a two-tier planning system. So it is an exceptional thing that we will do, and we do not want to get in a situation where we're calling in lots of planning applications and essentially undermining the whole purpose of the transfer of planning to councils, where councils are supposed to actually deal with these planning issues themselves, and not, if people are unhappy with it, go to the department will call it in, or if it's a difficult application, go to the department calls it in, and so on. So we definitely that's a kind of a key thing that we wanted to sort of lay down as a marker from the start. So the criteria, if you like, is really around whether or not it is a matter of sub-regional or regional importance, where it's really a matter for the centre, for the region as a whole, not a local matter, and so that can be, for example, an issue where there's a regional policy on a particular issue, say on built heritage or on flooding or something like that, where a decision that a council is making is actually deemed to be undermining the operation of that regional policy by setting a precedent that would mean that the policy is kind of undermined going forward and so on. So that is really the key test around that sort of sub-regional, regional issue raised by the application, and therefore it's something that we would be more appropriately dealt with by the centre. So it is not about, and we keep saying this, it is not about whether or not the council have made the right planning decision. It's not. We don't sort of decide to call it in because we don't like the planning decision. We decide to call it in because we think that this is an application which would be better dealt with by the department and the minister, because it's of regional significance and regional importance, and it raises issues of regional issues. So it's quite a kind of it's taken us a while, if I'm honest, to get to grips with all of that and to understand that, and a lot of discussions with how they work this in Scotland and England and Wales, but that's the way we approach it, and we've kind of got into that way of doing it now.
That's really useful, because it brings real clarity in terms of how that occurs. But even if they're called in, or if there's applications already deemed to be regionally significant, and the current legislation has a situation where the minister makes a decision in relation to that. I'm aware of other scenarios in the British Isles, such as Pornola, but also the UK Infrastructure Commission, where that was sort of taken a bit away from ministerial direction. Just to know what the views really in relation to the benefits associated with that, and why we decided to go down the ministerial route.
That's about making the decisions, Alan.
Get my chance at last. No, in terms of actually making the decisions, we think the system that we have in place at the moment seems to be quite responsive to our particular needs. I'm aware of the situation that you have on board Planola down south, looking at the decision, but we always have the scope here for the Planning Appeals Commission to become involved in any public inquiries or hearings, so we get their independent advice on many occasions, and I think that has been quite effective as well. when they get their view, and that can then be rolled into the decision-making process. So at the moment, there's, I think we always need to keep our eyes and ears open as to best practice elsewhere and what's going on. But at the moment, wouldn't perceive any potential changes at the moment.
Just one last thing. The whole issue of climate change is clearly here, and people know that it's a real issue. We should have been that a couple of years ago, or many years ago. But one of the things around planning is that, how much is that considered nowadays in terms of applications? So, for example, when houses are being built, they're not ready for e-cars and stuff like that, and whether that's something the department can give direction on, or is that something we're waiting for the councils to do, because we need to be building, for the future rather than for the past.
Yeah. Again, a good question. I mean, the strategic planning policy statement, when it came out just after transfer in 2015, did actually reflect the issue of climate change quite well. So it does require councils, both in making their decisions and ourselves as well, making our decisions, and in terms of them bringing forward their development plans to take account of climate change and the implications of climate change for planning, and properly in the way that they are bringing forward those decisions and those plans. I think, though, if I'm honest, there is probably a bit of capacity building and a bit of guidance and so on still needed to try and actually tease out more clearly what that actually means for planning and what the role of planning is in contributing to climate change, reducing the need to travel. If you bring forward effective plans which actually think through the issues of commuting and almost developing a town or a city in a way that creates more need to travel, that's obviously going to have an impact on climate change and on CO2 emissions and so on. So I think there is a requirement, but I think it's an area that we need to probably try and do a little bit more work on. And I don't know, Susan, on the plan side, whether or not you want.
Yes, well, obviously the plans that are progressing at the minute are doing so on the basis of existing policy. So the draft plan strategies that have been come forward already, they do refer to climate change, but probably in a way in relation to mitigation, and that would be through, as you say, sound land use planning and transport issues and maybe mitigation against flooding and so forth. So it has been a feature, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kimmins.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. It's just a couple of questions, I suppose. I noticed in the briefing paper you mentioned around Casement Park, and I suppose at the minute it's kind of centre of a lot of what's happening since the Assembly has come back. I suppose just in relation, I know the briefing had stated that, they're depending on the finalisation of the further environmental information process, there was a potential for a decision at the springtime. Are we still on track for that, or? Yeah,
so, certainly at the moment, you said, that's something that's been very current in the news, the issues all around Casement Park. It's one where there's quite diverse views being expressed to us, and those are views which we have to take and run through the process and look at fairly fairly and objectively when we come to make a final conclusion. In terms of timescale, I know that the issue is, possibly a decision round about Easter time has been mentioned in the press. While I can't confirm that to be the case because it has to run through the processes, that is a possibility. I would leave it at that.
Oh, that's good. And I suppose, and then in relation to that, at this stage, is all outstanding information for the progression of the project? Is it being accounted for? Do you foresee any other delays as it stands?
Mm-hmm. In terms of planning applications, until you actually make the final decision, there's always an opportunity for some additional information to come in. At this stage, the last information which we asked for from the applicant has been received. That's been consulted on at the moment. We don't know what the consultation response will bring up on that one. All I can say is, from a planner's point of view, you always hope that you're at the end of that process. And that hopefully that will allow us to go forward.
No, and I suppose at this stage there's been so many delays with the project. People are very, very keen to see it come to a decision. Just one other thing on that one. It's just, I know one of the outstanding issues was around noise pollution with the social club, and obviously with the new Casement Park it's going to be probably a lot more well attended. Has that been resolved at this stage, or is that still an issue?
In terms of this, in terms of how a planning application is worked, we won't come to any recommendation before all the information is before us, and other objections and letters of support in relation to that. So all these matters, once we have all that information to hand, we'll collate that and come to a recommendation before we place anything before a minister. But at this time, because that's still in formation and we haven't come to any conclusions yet, I can't really go any farther in relation to that. But
that's grand. No, thank you. Just in terms of, I suppose, the Planning Act and plan reviews, I've just recently come to the Assembly from 6 years in council, so very familiar with planning and planning issues and all of that type of thing. You had mentioned there about planning performance, and it's just really, in terms of the stats around that and for the 11 councils, do we, is there any way we can even see those, or were, are they published, or what? It's really, it would be interesting, I think, because I know some of the issues we face. I was nearly Morning Down, and we would have people complaining and things like that, which I know is probably right across. So it would be interesting to kind of get a sense of where that all sits. And maybe not for today, but just going forward, even if we...
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're available. The statutory indicators are available. They're monitored quarterly, and then there's sort of an annual report put out on those as well. So they're available on our website, and you can see, the performance of individual councils and the overall performance. Although, a lot of the work that we're doing with the councils is about trying to kind of get away from that kind of... You'll be familiar with it in councils, it's almost like a competitive thing. It can be good in some ways, but we're trying to work much more collaboratively with them to try and bring everybody up to sort of a good standard on it. And then also the planning monitoring framework is published annually. So that was published in September, and that contains more information, which is sort of a couple of pages on each council. And how they're doing on different issues. Okay, no,
that's fair enough. And I suppose, as you said, it's not a good system if people are working competitively, because everywhere has their unique issues and things that can cause difficulty. So I suppose it's trying to nail those down and find ways forward. So just, I suppose, in relation to the Planning Act as well, I know that it requires the department to review it every 3 years.
It's after 3 years and then every 5 years.
So at this stage, have we a date for review?
Well, as I was saying earlier, we're already, obviously, we've missed 3 years, so we'll be talking to the Minister about bringing forward the review of the implementation of the Act and what the terms of that review will be, and that has to be set out in supporting legislation, which will come to the committee. So that will be in the next sort of month or two, that will be coming here.
No, that's fair enough. Okay, no, that's fair enough. That's great, thank you.
Just on that, do you collate information in relation to the number of judicial reviews that have been taken against each of the authorities? And an analysis of that as to whether or not they've been successful or
That's
otherwise.
actually one of the issues that has come up at the strategic planning group, where actually we did ask, could we try and get information from each of the councils on judicial reviews. It's been difficult, to be honest, to get that. I'm not quite sure why. We've been pushing it. We also tried through DSO to go in and get information through the courts on it, but again, that's they don't really collate the information by council area, so it's a work in progress, I think, on that. It's something that will be taken up with the heads of planning again on the strategic planning group, to try and understand. I mean, I think it's definitely worthwhile to try and understand what's going on around the judicial reviews. We obviously do keep a very close eye on judicial reviews as well, in terms of when they come out, and we would analyse those and try and get to grips with what key things are being said. There have been some very interesting decisions recently about the way councils make decisions and so on, which we are talking to the councils about. And for example, I put out a chief planner's note every so often. The last one referred to that, the Knox judgment, which is around the kind of decision-making processes that councils take for making decisions.
Of course, an excessive number doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem in the council either. There could be someone who's very disgruntled and they want...
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be careful with statistics.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Ms Anderson.
Thank you for the presentation. When you reference the statutory process of planning being in Dara, do you mean with regards to the environmental compliance, or is that a general application of the statutory process where it is located? And I say that because as a committee we're pursuing how by default we're told that the statutory responsibility for the Reservoir Act is in Dara, but the staff are in the department you work in. So we were wanting to, and when you said that, it rang a bell with me. I thought, is this another part of this, where part of the responsibility is located in one department, but the staff are in another? So just generally to get an understanding of that. Also, I see that part of your key responsibilities is North-South spatial planning, and to get a handle on where that's at, what kind of spatial planning is being done on an all-Ireland basis, and then in the context, because I'm assuming that as part of looking what will happen in the future relationship, what could potentially happen with the level playing field not being in there, with the environment not being in there, then how is that going to impact when you may have two different regimes of environmental compliance, north and south, and to get an understanding of where you're at with working with your way through how that is going to play itself out. I have a particular concern about the Maboy dump scandal. I raised it at the last meeting, but I had hoped to engage with yourselves, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so today. And you talked about about the amazing transfer process that has taken place. I'm not sure if this is around the strategic, whether it is in the strategic planning directorate, Mr. Biggs, or are you with yourself, Mr. Chair? But I would like to get a handle on what has happened since the Mills review. When you consider the language that report used around flourishing conditions for eco-crime. Now that's a damning indictment on any department for a review to talk about illegal dumping that had taken place, illegal waste, is essentially getting planning permission to do so. So I would like to understand, and this is maybe where there is overlaps, because you talked about oversight and governance, and particularly in the context of environmental compliance, and that being part of now within your own directorate. But perhaps the retrospective planning might have come from your directive, but you could explain that to me. A firm, which Chair I will not name obviously, who has been involved in the boy responsibility for quarrying, and it is my understanding that there were a number of retrospective applications that were put in for after quarrying took place for illegal dumping waste to be put in those quarries, and those applications were given. Not on one occasion, not on two occasions, not on 3 occasions, but more. And that is really creating a lot of concern for particularly the residents and the people of Derry around the River Faughan. And I say that, and I know we're going to be dealing with this later, Chair, around flooding, but in 2017, where we had a situation where the abstraction point could not have been used because of the flooding that had taken place there, and there was concern around the Faughan about the water potential contamination that may or may not have taken place, and there's still people concerned about that. So how many retrospective planning applications were given to the quarrying of for illegal waste then to be put into? And then to understand what is the scale of retrospective planning. And I say that, I understand that people come along and there's retrospective planning applications, and of course that process is necessary and should be supportive, but not for, in my opinion, repeated retrospective plans for illegal waste dump to go into a site. So those are the concerns that I have, and I would like to know, because of the situation that has taken place, what learning has been done from the Mills review? Where are we at to ascertain and to give certainty and assurances to people that what happened before will never ever be repeated again, where we will give planning application retrospectively to a firm who is involved in what the report calls a flourishing condition for eco-crime. So if I could just get some understanding, I'm not sure if it falls into either or both of your remits.
Thank you for that, Chair. If it's okay, there's a number of issues there you've raised. So I think there's one around the statutory consultee and the DERA thing, and the North-South spatial planning point. And I think then you've raised kind of general questions about retrospective kind of planning and so on, which if I deal with those sort of three, and I'll maybe pass to Scott to talk about the retrospective planning one when it comes to it, because Scott's been doing some work around the environmental governance work on that. And then finally, if Alistair deals with my boy, because he's been working on my boy, which is kind of, I suppose, the specific example of all of this. So first of all, on the statutory consultee point in DERA, it's not another example of that transfer. Thank goodness. You know, I'm kind of looking back at colleagues who probably will be talking later on about some of that stuff on the reservoirs. But no, it's not that. It's basically just DERA appropriately. They're the statutory consultation body for planning on nature conservation issues. Okay. So they're the statutory experts we go to in planning for those issues, and they're in the right place for that. In terms of the North-South spatial planning, we do a lot of work, we do a lot of work on planning with all the jurisdictions. Sort of twice a year, there's a chief planners meeting with all five. We call it the 5 administrations meeting, where all 5 chief planners get together and move around the different countries and talk about shared kind of concerns and angst around planning. And I find it a very useful meeting, because you can talk about, there are very similar issues that we all deal with, and you know, there's different solutions and different innovations and ideas that come from all the jurisdictions. We work specifically with colleagues down south a lot as well. We have a collaborative framework for cooperation, which was established a number of years ago. I went through the executive, and that allows us to you know, link up. We've done work with the Derry and Donegal councils, who are doing a lot of work together on the northwest, and we've attended lots of conferences and seminars and worked with them on that. We do work on the sort of development plan side, in terms of bringing together plan managers from the border counties, because obviously you know, a lot of the planning doesn't just stop at the border, and the environmental impacts don't stop at the border, and all of that. So there is work that goes on that's kind of a mutual benefit within that framework, really across a number of areas. The regional development strategy, and linking up with what the Republic of Ireland are doing around their national development plan and the national planning framework and so on, is another area where we collaborate on. I could go on. There's work going on in the north-south Dublin corridor, an ESPON kind of proposal that we're taking forward in that's looking actually at the impacts of climate change on that corridor, and so on. So there is some work going on that. I'm going to pass over to Scott just to talk.
Just before you pass over, could you maybe explain what work that you're doing, just forecasting into the future, particularly as we go through this transition period, and the level playing field not being there, and the implications that may or may not have for planning?
Yeah. No, I suppose the current situation with that is that in this transition period, the regulatory regimes are the same. So, EIA, for example, applies down south, applies here as well. But we are involved in the work that's being taken forward centrally, I suppose, around frameworks for the different policy areas, like environmental governance and so on. So we link up with DERA, who are doing work around the Environment Bill and that sort of thing. We also link up with our colleagues in MHCLG in London around the implications for planning of EIA, habitats, regulations, and strategic environmental assessment, and how those will all be handled going forward within the UK.
But have you done an impact assessment of having to potentially work to different regimes? As you said, it doesn't stop at the partition part of Ireland. So planning is something that is across the island, and the work that you've already been involved in. So the implications of environment not being included in the level playing field for here, and having a different regime here than what there would be, in the south, and then how that is going to impact on that planning application process, or the work that you're doing around spatial planning.
Yeah, no, we haven't done a specific analysis on that, but that is probably something that we will look at. But we need to try and understand, how is it going to actually end up and work out in practice. Is there going to be kind of complete regulatory alignment around the environmental issues, which would make sense and would help planning? So until we kind of get an understanding of that, it's probably difficult for us to do too much on that. But it's certainly an area that we're fully aware of and considering and working with colleagues both down south and locally here and across the water. So if Scott maybe wants to say a bit about the tricky issue of retrospective applications, particularly the environmental governance issue more generally.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the planning system allows for retrospective applications, but over time concerns have been expressed for a number of reasons, particularly over minerals applications, because retrospective applications for minerals applications can result in significant harm and irreversible harm. And as part of the concerns that have been raised, we have been looking, we've developed an environmental governance work programme because of various concerns and escalation in environmental concerns in the planning system over the last number of years. But one of the key things we're focusing on is the issue of retrospective minerals applications and unauthorised EIA development. And we're currently actually developing the first tranche of the EIA guidance, which we intend to produce hopefully before the summer, will be specifically on the issue of how to deal with retrospective minerals applications. One of the issues with them is that they'll often attract requirements under the Environmental Directive, EIA Directive. And once you get into the territory of retrospective applications being unauthorised EIA development, then there's a lot of case law which suggests that the bar should be very high indeed for a developer to get planning permission for that. So that's something, but it's a very, very complicated area of planning because the EIA directive never actually, it didn't envisage a situation where you would have an unauthorised development for which you would have to get retrospective or application or permission after the fact. So the principles around how you deal with that is built up through case law. So guidance around this hasn't actually been produced in any of the jurisdictions yet. So we have a draft of that guidance now, which we need to run past our senior counsel before producing it. But yes, I mean, a lot of that came out of what happened in and around the Maboy Road site, which obviously there's been various complaints at different levels about how that was dealt with. But one of the issues was obviously dealing with retrospective applications rather than going in and enforcing robustly against the quarries. And I think one of the lessons to be learned in the planning system is when it comes to unauthorised development, particularly potentially very harmful development like unauthorised minerals, is that councils and or the department, as the case may be, should go in and take robust and swift enforcement action and not end up in the position where you have to deal with retrospective applications. And because Maboy Road, because you arguably that culture, if you like, perhaps created some of the conditions for the illegal dumping. So we're very aware that it's important.
But how was that allowed to happen, given that you didn't need to get to the end of this process to realise, Houston, there's a problem? You know, this assembly had a motion in 2014. There had already been information that was brought to the departments from 2011, 2012, even before the Assembly debated this chair. So how many applications did, for instance, that particular firm receive? When did the department decide we need to put a stop to this and not allow the spread of the quarrying to take place so that more illegal dumping could happen as a consequence of it? Because to end up with a report that talks about a flourishing condition of eco-crime and really that illegal waste was essentially done with planning permission is an absolute shocking indictment, and you don't need guidance to know that that's a problem. So it's at what point did the red flag, what point was that waved in the department to say this must stop and we have got a problem and this is extending? We have mission creep here with regards to dumping that's spreading out, and then as a consequence of 2017 we have a situation with the abstraction point that could not be used for the Faughan drinking water because of the difficulties that could potentially cause to the residents and citizens of Derry.
I think we're probably getting into specifics about Maboy. I don't know, Alistair, if you want to maybe update on where we are with Maboy.
Yeah, I mean, you have asked a question about a situation at Maboy, which, you know, if you were living there or in the vicinity, clearly that's something that was going to cause you great concern. And as you also said, the Mills report responded to that, and I know the recommendations that have been taken forward by our colleagues in DERA. In terms of the planning application history, I can't think off the top of my head anything in regard to retrospective consents, but I can confirm that to committee.
Chair, could we ask for some information on that? Just
we can certainly get that for you.
And with the dates around
when we can certainly do that. At the moment, certainly DERA is carrying forward its own investigation into that, and there is to be a court case heard in relation to events out there, which I think is due to be heard about September of this year. For reasons regarding that, I wouldn't want to go into too much detail in relation to that. We also, as a department, have enforcement notices on the site, and we have a close working relationship with our colleagues in DERA in relation to how we go forward from where we are now, and I think that is important to focus on, is how we try to resolve the situation in relation to the site. And we're looking at an integrated remediation strategy with our colleagues. Again, that's being headed up by DERA, and a number of the department or the directorates within the Department for Infrastructure are on the relevant project board there. So there's good liaison in relation to that, and we would hope to move on forward from there with all the stakeholders.
The Planning Commission Appeals has already said that the enforcement order has to be taken forward. So there's already been a challenge to that, and it has already ruled that, despite the knowledge that you've just imparted here, and members are aware that there's an ongoing case, but even that, notwithstanding that, they said the enforcement order needs to be implemented.
Yeah. There was a hearing in front of the Planning Appeals Commission in relation to one of the notices, and a timescale was given for that to be enacted. But it's the sort of thing in relation to all those notices. Any action on the foot of that would clearly need to be discussed with the Minister, and in the context of the situation at the time, and also having regard to how the remediation strategy is coming on. So we'd obviously want to be in close contact with everybody involved there as to how things are proceeding.
Members probably content that we can maybe return to this again and follow it up with correspondence if required.
Okay.
Thank you, Miss Anderson. Sorry, Mrs. Kelly.
Thanks very much, Chair. Chair, can I just pick up, though? I understand there was substantive illegal dumping on the River Foyle as well, at the Fawn River, and I'm not sure if that's subject still to legal proceedings or not. But I believe that there was a cross-border element and organised crime gangs involved. And I just wonder, had the NCA's expertise been brought in pursuit of those responsible? And if the fines were insignificant in relation to being able to bring, if the criminal evidence was insufficient, had any thought been given to go under some of the unexplained wealth orders in relation to some of those responsible?
Is this separate to the Maboy site?
Yes.
Can I clarify? I'm afraid that certainly that might be a matter for the council. I'm certainly not aware of any detail in relation.
In relation to DERA.
Well, I find it strange because NIEA were involved.
It will not be for planning.
I know. It's probably moved to the environment bit, but we'll chase that up too. Perhaps, sorry, can I just? Most of the points have been covered, so I'm not going to go back over them. But I understand, in terms of the area development plans and in terms of the voluntary exit scheme, that the department's staff and resource was deplenished considerably. And has that had any impact then on the timeframes in relation to the development plans? And if so, have you been able to bring in some additional expertise to assist? Because the plans do take a considerably long time. You know, you could lose the will to live waiting on them, really, you know.
I mean, I suppose at the point of transfer, the vast majority of planning staff left the old DOE and moved over to councils, with only a small kind of rump retained here, and about 400 staff moved across, you know, broadly lining up with the old, if you remember back, the old planning service divisions. There have been 6 divisions, so that was converted to 11 councils, and there were some additional staff, if you like, had to be put in place to facilitate that in terms of, you know, heads of planning and so on. But I suppose since then, you know, the councils have recruited, you know, generally, some more than others, to bring staff in. And I think probably, you know, the councils would say, you know, we would like to have more resource. We would say, well, we transferred everybody that we had across, you know, and over time they have actually been able to add to that and supplement that. And I think that's a good thing. It's been a good thing for the planning profession generally. It's allowed graduates to come in to the profession who weren't actually for quite a number of years before that able to get jobs in Northern Ireland. So yes, they probably would like to have even more resources and bigger teams bringing forward the plans. But I think, you know, as Susan has said and Alistair, there's been, you know, quite good progress across all 11 councils when you consider all the change and all the new processes and the new approaches. You know, and yes, we're working on them to try and bring those things through even more quickly. But you know, progress has been okay, I think, you know, this far.
Chair, just want to put in record, I think I had a lot of experience in terms of delays by other statutory consultees, and I would urge the department to chivvy them along a bit and look at the process and timeframes. But that's about all. Everything else covered, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Boylan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. Angus, you're welcome by.
Thank you.
We're not this one. You're a happy chappy now. Your football team's doing okay. I have a number of questions, Chair, and I'll try to move through them as quickly as possible because, I mean, I was on the committee that transferred the powers, and we had a long discussion, and it's interesting hearing some of the points from some of the members. There are things we can learn from, but we often said be careful of what you wish for when we transfer these powers, and we have a number of councillors here now coming off council who've had the experience of that. But I just want to pick up on a few points and then have a number of questions I'll ask directly. In terms of the overview of the Act itself, is there now an opportunity to look at the workforce model, or is that solely down now just to councils itself? Because clearly there, if you look at the points you're saying, Angus, in relation to the average number of weeks in taking the process forward, maybe there's an opportunity to look at, because I mean all of us have working relationships with most of the council. I mean, ABC Council and Newry and I deal with mostly, and I mean we know some of the pressures are under, but we know some of the good decisions being made. So I would just say in terms of the review, let's have a look at the workforce model. As far as the committee is concerned, there's a number of you said there's a number of subordinate legislative pieces to come forward. We get sight of that, or I mean obviously they'll be looking the committee here maybe to look to support some of those pieces. Maybe you can throw the other ones. There's of a number of questions, so I'll just try and float through. Yes, the LDPs. I mean, they're not extinct from the regional development plan. So obviously, the question we're really asked is, I mean, council now have the autonomy to do their own thing in terms of LDPs, but there should be a wee bit of ambition there in terms of develop the areas, because the ABC councils are a relatively big council now, so I'd like to see for the development, and I'd like to see that recognised. And I don't know whether that's in the 9 or 8 parter process, but certainly I would like to see, you know, given the opportunity to do that. The other point I'd like to make, and maybe you could, the issue of, although we say Lucia, but Lucia will do, the issue of the covenant. I mean, I know that a number of MLAs and councillors had contacted us in relation to that site. It's part of a broader programme for council, and they're keen to move the process on and develop. Could you maybe expand, or where exactly we're at? I mean, people would be keen to see that for that area. And I suppose I'm going through quickly here, Chair, as quick as I can. There's now a number of questions, and probably Angus, they're over to you in relation to, I want to just pick on the Dalradian gold mine stuff in relation to that process. There was all the information submitted there. Could you give a wee update in relation to that, and maybe the issue of a public inquiry? The ARC 21 process as well. I know there was a number of complaints in light of climate change, in light of the environmental issues that the people are raising now. Just I want you to maybe respond to that in relation to that. The issue of developer contributions. I know that as part of the Act we had introduced that. I know Scotland has brought forward a new model now in terms of developer contributions, and I'm mindful of the fact the opposite end of developer contributions is where that actual cost goes. I do believe that developer contributions should be used for communities, green initiatives, and anti-poverty measures. So if we were looking at that, I'd prefer to see it used that way, but I'm mindful of where the cost would go in relation to that. I mean, if a developer was to put that on a site, where would that go? But even in terms of major infrastructure projects. And on my final point, I want to just pick up, if I can, the issue of permitted development rights on oil and gas exploration and the petroleum exploration. Just a wee update on that. I know there was talk about removal, there was talk about consultation in relation to some of the stuff. The options were brought forward to the Minister. Is there, could you expand a wee bit on how we could find out where we're at with that, and whether the committee will see the site of those consultation responses? I mean, clearly it's predicated on the issue of all the people's mentioned climate change and all those green issues. There's a lot of opposition out there to those things nowadays, but just a wee bit of, if you'd like to respond to some of those questions. I think that's all the ones I have, Chair.
Okay, there's quite a lot there. So what I would propose is Alistair will deal with sort of St Lucia and Dalradian and R21 and the local development plan one, and if I pick up the rest of them, if that's okay. In terms of that sort of issue about the workforce model and staffing and so on, I mean, that's really in the past now. We had that sort of model at the point of transfer, and we're now in a situation where it's really up to the councils to look after their own staffing and their own resources. We don't really have a role there with that. We can't. I mean, we do a bit of work with them in terms of interchange, where there's an opportunity for some staff to move across and work in a council, or for some council staff to come and work in central government, which is really good for staff development and career development and so on. But really, in terms of the model, it's really for each council to sort that out themselves. The issue about the subordinate legislation programme, that kind of leads into the oil and gas question. We will be coming forward with subordinate legislation across a range of issues, would be my assumption, but I still have to have the conversation with the Minister about the various different pieces of subordinate legislation, and we'll be talking to her, for example, today about the telecommunications area, and we're permitted development proposals in and around that. But again, that'll be for her to decide, and should she decide to go forward with that, then we will, of course, be going through the usual subordinate legislative process, which will involve yourselves here in the committee. So there are a number of areas, and I suppose, which I touched on, I think, at the start: telecommunications, the review of the Act, and also the issue you have mentioned about oil and gas. So we did, as you alluded to there, in 2016 go out for public consultation on options for removing permitted development rights for oil and gas exploration. Just to kind of be clear about, it's about exploration, not about the actual extraction of those minerals. And we will be talking to the Minister about the outcome of that, and about the options for taking forward that removal of permitted development rights for oil and gas. And then, I suppose, as I've said, subject to what the Minister decides, we will then be coming forward, if she decides to remove those permitted development rights, we'll be coming forward with the subordinate legislation to the committee to do that. The developer contributions issue is an interesting one. That's one of the ones that we have had quite a bit of engagement with councils on since transfer, and probably one of the things that has been a feature of the new two-tier system is that councils have actually made a bit more use of developer contributions in Section 76 of the Planning Act than maybe the old DOE would have done, which took quite a sort of a conservative approach to developer contributions. So the power is there, as you rightly said, and it is being used by some councils. There are issues with it in terms of the viability issue. You know, it's a brilliant facility that the planning system has to make sure that through a planning agreement that the developer contributes to the implications and impacts of a particular development by providing infrastructure, by providing a contribution towards some other impact that the development may have, and you know, it allows you to take on board issues like climate change and green issues as well, in terms of you know, open space provision and other issues as well. So that is there, and that is a power that can be made use of. There is a viability issue, as you've rightly said, and you know, you've got to get that balance right about what it is that's reason for the developer to contribute to, and with a view of actually where does the money come from, if you like, for all of that. So that is something that we've worked quite closely with the councils on, tried to encourage. We introduced a practice note on developer contributions in Section 76, so that's been kind of published and is available on our website, and sort of sets out how to operate that function. And we have been pretty clear with the councils that we feel the best way for them to deal with developer contributions is actually to flag it up in their development plans, because then developers have an understanding of the expectation that will be around a particular site.
So there's no intention of widening the scope, even having a discussion with ministers down to the councils now on the authority and that in relation to, yeah.
Well, the scope is the scope set in Section 76. You know, it's developer contributions and a planning agreement really around the actual development itself and mitigating the implications of that development in planning terms. There is the whole wider debate about if you like a community infrastructure levy type approach, which they have in England, which is almost more like a levy or a tax, which applies not through like a Section 76 type agreement, but just applies generally to certain types of development in certain locations. But that would be, I think, that would be in this jurisdiction something that would need to be taken forward at executive level, because it's based really around an understanding of the overall costs of, if you like, to the public person servicing a town or a city, and then coming up with what's a reasonable contribution that could be made by developers in that area, and a levy set on that basis. So that's something that's obviously out with this department and individual councils, cuts across the whole of government, education, health, and so on. So there was some thinking done that, I think, in a previous assembly, but it is something that maybe could be taken forward. I think that's, unless I missed anything, my stuff that on those issues. So I may pass over to you, Alistair.
Yeah, thanks, Angus. Just to go through the queries there. St Lucia, it's a fascinating site there on the edge of the town, so we can understand the great interest in it and how that's going to be brought forward. At the moment, we've been discussing that with the Department for Communities, and who have been bringing forward an strategic outline business case for the site to look at potential options for the site. That's something that we'll be briefing the Minister on in due course. And there's lots there to look at, the historic core, the difficulties with the condition of the building. With any old building that's been left for a time, they'll have to be brought up to a certain standard to look at. There's also issues around the existing military housing on the site, and how everything relates to the Struel River, and again with everything across that river there and the open space over there. So we do hope to be taking something forward to the Minister relatively shortly in relation to that. In terms of the planning applications, you've referenced Dalradian. Now, at the time of the submission, you'll recall that cyanide had been proposed to use to help extract ore as part of the processing on the site. I think it was about August last year the application was amended to remove that process from the site, and amendments were made to the application. A significant amount of further environmental information therefore came before to us to be assessed. That's in the process of going through the system at the moment, but at this time, as with any planning application, it's difficult to comment on the merits of the case when they're still being processed through. Art 21, we recall the situation there. The decision to approve the application was quashed by the courts. Again, that was submitted back to us, and again, further environmental information was submitted in relation to that, and again, that is again going through the process of being analysed at the moment. And that's really where we stand with those particular applications. I hope that answers your queries in relation to that. And can maybe pass on to Susan.
Yes, you're right. The local development plans, the plan strategies that have come forward to date are all ambitious, and they all want to grow, and the department would be, of course, supportive of that. In terms of the early engagement that we have with the councils, we always bring them back to the fact that this is now in a soundness-based approach to their plans moving through an independent examination. And in that respect, we would ask them to look at their evidence and make sure that they are producing or suggesting policy that can be effective and coherent and can actually work, because those are the issues that will be tested through the independent examination. Newry Morning Down and Banbridge plans at the minute, they're both at the earlier stage. They haven't produced their plan strategies yet, so they're still moving through that process. But early engagement with us and other stakeholders is key in this process, and we are very supportive of that. We sit on a number of plan working groups and steering groups to feed as much information and provide as much guidance to the councils during this process as we can.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Beggs.
Okay. Thanks for your information you've given us. And I'm looking at, in terms of the indicators that you monitor local planning decisions or planning decisions generally, you've indicated, basically look at the length of time that it takes for local decisions, for major planning decisions, and then it's come to light that the target for major planning decision was 30 weeks, but the last time that you've indicated it was monitored was 18-19, some 59 weeks, almost twice the target. What's happening here?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the area that's been the most difficult and the most challenging in terms of trying to get performance to move forward a bit faster. The thresholds that if you like, identify which applications are major are actually quite high in terms of the new two-tier system. That's something that's come up a number of times about maybe something that we need to look at. So the major applications are, to put it another way, there's actually quite a lot of fairly major applications that fall into the local category. So for example, housing developments under 50 houses are local. I don't know if that's really right in Northern Ireland, because if you have 50 house development in a kind of a town in Northern Ireland, that's quite a big development. And to be honest, we don't have that many housing developments over 50 houses. But if they're over 50 houses, they're then major. So it gives you a sense of the size of the major applications. They really are the big ones, and they are the more complex ones. So they are the ones that the councils are struggling to deal with. The local ones do encompass quite a lot of fairly significant development, which they are dealing with a lot better and a lot more quickly. But look, as I said earlier, it's a key focus that we're really focusing on. The review of the planning system commissioned by Hawks, and the planning forum that we set up for Assembly Consultees, the work that we're doing in the strategic planning group and the subgroup that Scott is chairing. There's a whole range of work that we're trying to do to try and push this down. can. And it's not just as simple as, the statutory consultees are slow or the statutory consultees are late. There's a whole range of issues around case management and the approach that councils take to dealing with the individual applications. The nature and quality of the application when it comes in is a key factor, because quite often we have a culture here in Northern Ireland where developers and agents put in applications which really aren't of a sufficient quality, and some of the other jurisdictions would just be kicked back out again. So we're looking at all these areas.
Those figures are 18-19. What's the current figure?
That's the latest kind of figure that I have. We do monitor them. Quarterly, so I can get you the more up to date figure. I can certainly send that back through after the meeting.
And is there no assessment of the quality of decisions that are being made by councils? Mention was made of judicial reviews, but you don't even have that collated by council. Is it not possible to get the postcode? There's hardly too many judicial reviews in Northern Ireland. Is there not a mechanism of solving this, either talking to other the court service or other department, or simply just getting the postcode and working out which council they're in? I mean, what sort of numbers are there of them?
Again, it's difficult to say, and that's part of the reason why we've been trying to investigate if we can get this information by council. I mean, there aren't a huge number of judicial reviews.
Are you monitoring other possible red flags, such as when councillors take decisions against their local planning officer's recommendation, against the local area plan? And in particular, are you monitoring whether any dominant groups on planning committees are going against the planning officer and the area plan?
Yeah, well, I talked about the planning monitoring framework that we published in September, and that's the one that includes some additional indicators which are trying to really tease out more about the quality side of things. So, for example, that includes the stats on the number of planning applications decided by planning committee, the percentage of committee decisions decided against officer recommendation, percentage of applications made under delegated powers, and things like that, which are all indicators as to how efficiently and effectively the committee is working, and it gives you a sense of the extent to which committee maybe is overturning officer decisions. And also we've been working with the PAC to try and introduce an indicator to the next one around the performance of councils at planning appeals. The number of planning appeals that they're winning and losing, which is also an indicator to sort of the quality of the decisions which is coming through.
And is this information available publicly?
The planning monitoring framework was published on our website. It was published in September, and the intention is that we do that every year. We also do, through the sort of the notification process that we have built into the planning system, where decisions are made that are contrary to statutory consultee advice, they are notified to us, and that's one of the situations where we can decide whether or not to call a planning application in, and we do monitor that, so we have a good sense of the number of times that is referred to us.
Okay. Turning then to some of your other areas of responsibility, Crumlin Road Jail and St Lucia Barracks. The Crumlin Road Jail, you said it's out to a private company to manage and run it. Are they paying rent, or is the department paying the rent?
No, they're paying us at their LSE, and they're contributing. Can't remember off the top of my head the exact figure which they contribute, but yes.
Okay, and you'll be going through some form of competitive process for the new...
They went through yeah,
okay.
That's the intention at the moment.
Turning to St Lucia Barracks then, there's 40 homes on that, which were lived in and presumably up until 2010. Have they been sitting empty since then?
They have been empty. They're the sort of building really that they're not up to modern standards at all. My recollection is they're probably a single brick construction, therefore they're not really suitable to put people and families into at the moment.
Okay. This is an asset, and the department's under significant financial pressures. Are you proposing to move the asset to housing association, to sell off if we're not using it? What's happening with this site?
Well, at the moment, what we're doing is simply considering the options for the site. It has I say it's a very interesting site with its particular location, but it does have issues which you need to look at in terms of getting access into the site, the condition of buildings and so on. That's something that we're working on and discussing with the Council and the Department for Communities. So at this stage we've no firm proposal to bring forward, but we will be briefing the Minister in due course on potential options for the site.
Would you accept that public assets have to be used for the public benefit, and the sooner a decision is made to utilise this asset, the better? That's 10 years ago it was gifted to the Northern Ireland Executive, and 10 years is a long time. No business would sit with that empty during all that time.
Yeah, it was one of those sites where we have had the issue regarding the restrictive covenant, which was only taken off in 2018 to look at as well. But yes, we appreciate that that's something that we need to look at and try to bring forward.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Angus, you mentioned in your introduction that you are currently looking at bringing forward some legislation, and obviously the committee are very keen to get a sense of when that may be, because we've spoken to a number of officials who've said there's legislation coming, and I suppose we really want to look at a timetable going forward. So do you have any concept of what that may look like?
I mean, I think that the various pieces of supporting legislation which I've referred to today are in the next few months. But I'm just conscious. I mean, I haven't had discussions with the Minister on them yet, so that's what I need to do before I can kind of be definitive about it. But I mean, you know, assuming those conversations take place and we decide to move forward with them, they'll be in advance of the summer. For the vast majority of them, and I mean, I know I'll be working closely with the team to make sure that as soon as we know something is going to be going forward, that we, you know, pass on the timescale to yourselves, so that you can begin to plan your work and make sure that it fits in with how you guys.
And this will be secondary legislation as opposed to primary legislation.
Yes. Yeah.
That's useful to know. Conscious that perhaps everyone may bring things in a rush together towards the end of the mandate. We only have a short time left, really, considering the time that it takes to scrutinise, but thank you very much. No one else has indicated, so thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Very much appreciated. Thank you. Members, if you're content, we're just going to break for a couple of minutes.
Yes.
Yep.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound.
Okay, thank you, members. Our next briefing was rivers and flooding, and we have run over our time quite considerably, so if members are content that we'll defer that to a later meeting.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving then on to the draft forward work programme. Just draw your attention to that at page 55. Community Transport Association, they're now unavailable for the 4th of March and they've rescheduled for the 6th. Strategic Planning Day was for the 11th of March. We're going to reschedule that to the 18th because we may not have time if we're going to get a briefing from Northern Ireland Water and a tour. So we'll move it to the 18th, and then the briefings that are scheduled for the 18th will be rescheduled for the 1st of April, and the visit to Wrightbus will also be rescheduled as well. So this is all very fluid and a bit of a work in progress. So if you're content to bear with us at this stage.
Chair, just to see when we're looking at the work programme, it might be helpful just to say to the clerk, see where you're talking about a tour, or any, if that was put in there as well. Is it in it? Okay, I'm looking at mine, so it's not here, but that's okay.
Okay.
So just to clarify with the Chair, see on the 4th, we have the departmental briefing on roads and TransLink, and then the rivers people as well.
No, we'll have to reschedule
But
them to another day. I
It's
think
proving difficult to get through this business.
it is.
so
It's going to be very difficult to have. We've only got 2 briefings, and we can't get through 2 briefings at the moment. So, okay. So, if you're content then to agree that, yes. If you look actually at the forward work programme where it says committee visits,
I'm just realising how now to read
I
the
didn't
information
realise
that's
it.
there.
Okay, thank you.
Bear
Then,
with me as I
moving on.
navigate my way through
Members
all
of any
this.
other business? No. Okay, thank you. The next meeting will take place next Wednesday, the 4th of March, in the Senate chamber. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber